Okay, hello everyone. I am back at Canon Press. Um, and I learned through Google that I cannot actually tell when people are watching. So, unless they're my friends, which is interesting. So, I'm just going to ramble for a few minutes. Hi, Hannah. There we go. Yes, or if you comment, I can see you. I'm going to ramble and see how. Oh, there we go. No, there is a little eye. I'll let people join in before I get started talking about character and dialogue. Thanks to those of you who have sent me messages and left feedback that you're enjoying it. I'm glad it's helping people. It's actually been really fun for me also to kind of think more deeply about the process, because sometimes I tend to like shoot from the hip when I'm writing or drafting or whatever, or I'll be doing things, but I won't really have like the why am I doing things thought out in my head. So it's been good. Hello, Carolyn. Thanks for joining in. Hi, Zoe. Age 13, that's a good age for starting out writing. I also think the other reason that it's a little bit difficult to talk about character, unlike plot, is that there isn't necessarily like there isn't like a one size fit all. Like you don't have like a plot outline for when you're plotting your characters. There's a lot of different ways you can go about making your characters interesting or well-rounded, and it's not as easily quantifiable. So it's just not quite as straightforward as plot. Hi, Allie and Esther. Great. Glad to see people jumping on. But I think the character is probably more essential than plot even. So this, when I was preparing my notes for this, I think I end up being more anecdotal, like this is what works for me. But if you talk to any two writers, they're going to have different ways that they approach characters. Dialogue is more straightforward. There's real bad dialogue and there's better dialogue. So this is kind of how I arrive at characters that feel like they're real rather than cardboard pop-ups. I think it's important to research your people ahead of time, your characters, because I don't think you can make good plotting choices if you don't know your characters. So on the very surface level, you'll want to know the basics, right, about your character: their age, their hair color, their height, their gender, their nationality, those types of things. And then after you've figured out the basics, I would say you want to start to work on their backstory, because the things that have happened in their past make them who they are today. We're all a product of our environment, right? So if you were constantly told as a child that you could do anything you want, you're going to act differently than if you were told that you would never really amount to much. That character is going to think and act differently, those two characters. So for backstory, I like to look at kind of the big picture. Where were they born? Not just the location, but, was it a grand mansion or was it a shack on the edge of the woods? Who are their parents? Are they both still alive? Did the parents coddle them or treat your main character poorly? So like, what was the family interaction like? That's hugely shapes people, right? Is how they were raised, what their parents said to them and taught them. So what kind of upbringing did they have? What skills might they have learned as a child or picked up? What types of morals were instilled into them? Do they have siblings? Because firstborns act differently than thirdborns. What type of education did they get? What do they do now? If they're a grown-up, if they're an adult, what's their vocation? So those types of questions. And the nice thing about it is that as you're working on these, you'll come up with more questions yourself. But see Grace, Jacob, and Ada. Welcome. So those are backstory things. I actually find that it's really helpful to write little character vignettes, little, almost like a mini story about my main characters, because it helps me, instead of just writing out like age this, birthplace this, like sort of a fill in the blank questionnaire. If I write it more like a story, then it helps me to get into the creative mindset better. Like somehow it gets those creative juices going, it gets my inhibitions down, and I can just, rather than just staring at a wall and feeling like I'm pulling information out of the sky. An important caveat here, when you're writing a well-rounded character and you've given them some heartbreaking past or a lovely past, whatever their story is, you may be tempted to include that in the story because you think, wow, this is really neat and everyone should know it, with like a dozen flashbacks or rambling monologues or something. But do not do that. Think of it like the tip of the iceberg. You need to know these things about their past so that when it comes time for them to make a decision, they are making it based logically off the type of person that they are. But the reader may not necessarily need to know. I feel like doing that, like sort of information dumping right up front, was more in vogue like earlier in the history of the novel, when you'd like meet a new character and then the author would pause for like 3 to 5 paragraphs to give you backstory about them. Like Willa Cather does this. I just read My Antonia, and it was like we'd meet a new character and then she would go off on this, little tangent about the innkeeper and his life and his wife and his troubles with his wife and all this stuff, which is fascinating, but it doesn't really work for the way novels are approached today. And also, the other thing about doing that is it's not super memorable right up front. Think about, because we don't really know enough about the person. If you, let's say you were to ask someone that you barely know, so what made you move to the city? That, and they start talking. It's often interesting, but it's often also sometimes forgettable. And it's not nearly as interesting as someone that you've known for 5 or 10 years and you ask them a question. Or like if you were to say, or like to your grandpa, what was it like when you first met grandma? And he tells you that story. That's going to be a lot more interesting because you know him. So dumping character information up front is just never really a good idea. But it does make a story really rich when you throw things in along the way. Hi, Jen and Allie. Because, so throwing things in along the way is, we reference our past or our memories subconsciously a lot. You could have your character do something or be faced with a decision and then say, like, her father had always taught her to thank a man who opens the door for her. And then maybe she won't thank the person because it's in a scene where she's angry with her father, or maybe she will. But those types of little details really do add depth to your character. And I recommend, working them in throughout the story as much as you can. So I write usually like about 2 pages about my main characters when I'm working on my research. And I do this on my computer and I save it in a research file. Or if I'm using Scrivener, they have full character files. Scrivener is a pretty helpful tool for writers. If you don't have it, I'd recommend looking into it. I've written one complete novel on it, and I really liked it for the way I could like super easily pull up information and research that I'd done for the story I wrote that takes place in Venice, because I was constantly referencing the layout of the city and the streets. So to have it like in a tab on the side while I was writing was super helpful. So it's important to think about your characters and who they are today because of their past. In the Renaissance, so let's see. So we've talked about backstory, and then you kind of want to move on to like their personality now. In the Renaissance, writers thought that there were 4 elements or humors that could shape your personality. So they had like the melancholic personality, which is thoughtful and brooding and sentimental. There was the optimistic one, which is, of course, joyful and charitable and amorous. There was the rash or obstinate character, who's more quick to revenge or anger. And then there was the stoic character who was cool and calm under pressure. These are, I think, really interesting, like an interesting way to maybe think of who your character is like. And it's sort of like first step building blocks. Another thing I've done is to look up those, the personality types, and just look at kind of the adjectives that are under each of them. I don't know a whole lot about those because I find them not super helpful. But if you know what I'm talking about, those like INTJ or whatever, that if you look up like sort of the adjectives that are listed under those, you can kind of base a character off of a personality type when you're getting started. Because again, you're working with almost at the beginning like a trope of a character. You're like, you've got your clay mold. You're sort of slowly shaping them, so you can get started that way. You know, it's helpful if you want to say like, well, people who are more logical like to ask probing questions of other people until they're satisfied with the answer. That type of personality evaluation, maybe you'll have a character who does that, whereas maybe you have another character who is more passive, just easily accepts what other people tell her. So as you add in the details, along with their backstory and their personality, you need to pay attention to their motivations. So let's see. Oh, hi, Elizabeth. Oh, I can scroll down here. You love Scrivener, Carolyn? Yes, it's so helpful. It's a great tool. So for instance, with motivations, you want to be always thinking, what is this person's goal? Specifically, we're talking about in the books. So this is a more short-term thing, and it's usually pretty easily achievable. Cora wants to help her mother pull off a wonderful winter feast. But it's something they're working towards in their life. You want to look at what's their ambition. This is bigger, more vague and abstract. If their goal is maybe to get all straight A's in your story, maybe it's because your main character's ambition is to make their parents proud. So ambition is like a broader, maybe more nebulous thing, not quite as easily attainable as get straight A's. So those are some things I look at. I also look at what are my main characters' value systems. One book I read on writing characters used a really helpful tool, which is just to say, nothing is more important than X. So nothing is more important than making my parents proud, or nothing is more important than keeping my family alive. So being able to answer those types of questions, what's their highest good, the thing they value the most? And usually there's a couple things for your characters. One thing that's really interesting and helpful, I think, to do in a story is to have some of your main characters, or many of them, have different highest goods. So in The Winter King, Cora would say that nothing is more important than keeping her family alive, right? Nothing, that's her highest good. Nothing is more important than survival. For Peter, his, I would say, is loyalty to the king, to the Winter King. And these are both good things, right? Survival is good. Loyalty to your king is good. But if they are ordered incorrectly, if you're putting something up too high, then of course you're going to come into conflict with other people who are placing something else higher. So that's where you get some of the most interesting inter-character tension, is when people have a different answer to nothing is more important than X. And then, of course, this is going back to plot, but you kind of are wanting to look at like, what are the external and internal conflicts that your main character has? What is a weakness that she has that needs to be overcome? What are problems or struggles in her daily life with external people around her or her situation that she needs to overcome? So you've got your backstory, you've added in some personality, You have your character motivation. Now you want to add what I think of as kind of the finishing touches on a character, the things that really make them feel real. Another author calls them the noise, the character noise, like what makes them come alive. And this is the time, at least for me, when I start carrying a journal around with me. And because little bits of personality will hit you all the time when you are paying attention to interactions with other people. Like if I'm in these early drafting stages, sometimes something will hit me like, I bet that Cora really enjoys X. Or sometimes I'll just be walking along and like something will come to me like, oh, Greta would probably rub her hands together incessantly when she's nervous. Or you might see something that another character or that another person does, someone like the mailman or the grocer or someone, and you can say, like, notice something that they're doing and steal that for one of your characters. So for adding tics, do you have a friend who always says that one thing? Maybe she uses a phrase all the time. Or maybe you've noticed that he tilts his head to the side when he's listening to you talk. Those types of personality tics, you want to add that in as much as possible. And for this, like I said, it's good to be a student of the people around you. Try to think of your friends or family members and some of the things that you find the most memorable about them. And then maybe change it up a little bit so you're not just putting like your siblings in your books. You don't want people to read it and be like, is this me? But stealing little bits of personality and adding them together into a new character is a great idea. So going along with this, because you'll probably hear this if you haven't already, there's the age-old wisdom to write what you know, which means don't go off writing about somebody or something you don't understand, because the reader will be able to pick up on that. On the one hand, yes, if you are a 25-year-old unmarried woman, I would not recommend having your first novel be in the head of like a 55-year-old chief executive male officer at a firm. Unless maybe your dad is, or someone who's really close to you. A lot of times we can tell when people write outside of, I guess, their experience. Most often you'll find this in like men who try to write as women and just really struggle with getting inside the head of a woman, or women as men. Particularly when you're starting out, I think it's good to be careful not to do that. But on the other hand, you can do research. You can know really interesting people. Maybe you're particularly perceptive to people. So C.S. Lewis, that's one of the greatest strengths in Till We Have Faces, is that he writes like an 18-year-old petulant woman, and he does it really well. So I think that it's a good caution to have to be careful when you're picking your main character. But I wouldn't worry about it so much that you're not writing anything except for you. You really want to avoid putting yourself in your story. So when you're picking these things that you're going to layer onto your characters, think about the world you've created and what personality traits or hobbies or whatever would best serve the world that they are moving around in. If you are writing a story set at sea, it's not helpful for the story if your main character is like a really amazing race car driver. It's just not like the skill you should pick. For the story I set in Venice, I really wanted to describe the beauty of the plant life in Venice, but I was writing in first person from the point of view of my main character. And so I decided to give her the hobby of being an amateur botanist, because then she would know the names of the plants and the trees around her. She would take time to point them out. She would be delighted to see them and examine them. So then I was able to do the same thing as the narrator in the story. So you can gather these tics from the world around you. You can save them in journals. For some books, I've tried having conversations with my main characters. This might sound super weird. It probably is, but being a writer is super weird. But I envision it like putting us in just a room together, sitting across from each other, me and my characters, and just start typing and asking them questions and see what happens. Um, I've had some really great results that way. Another thing that I've done that I know a lot of writers do is they just write scenes between characters, and they know that these scenes are not going to make it into the final draft. So there's very little pressure involved, but it's just helpful to get to know them, to see how they interact with other people. Yeah, so both of those ways I think can work. Quick notes on consistency. If characters are consistent, right? That's one of like the biggest complaints you'll hear, especially in movies, is like, oh, I felt like this character was really inconsistent. They made this choice and it didn't make sense to me. So everyone in their lives is working towards a highest good. Your character should make choices based upon their morals, their presuppositions, their understanding of the world, not based off of what you need them to do to propel the plot forward, right? You can, and that's usually when you can tell, like, if you have a soldier who always stops to help like peasants in need, that's a strong defining quality about him. If he doesn't do that on page 95, then there better be a really good reason for it, and not just like, well, I had to get him to the next scene quickly. So, but he can choose to not do it, because that leads to comment number 2, which is that characters contain contradictions, right? We all do. If the soldier in that previous example doesn't stop to help people in need, then why? What happened? You can intentionally make your character break their own moral code. In fact, you should, because we do this all the time. We do not act the way we want to act. We do things we wish we hadn't. We don't really know ourselves. We are the most blind to our own shortcomings. We don't see ourselves for who we really are. And so that's both immensely relatable to a reader when a character does that. And it's also pretty satisfying to feel like you can see a character better than they can see themselves. I need to scroll down. Oh, hi, Hannah. Meg, that's quite the sad face. I don't know when that popped up. If you have a character who is determined and makes snap decisions all the time, then we should see her hesitate and be indecisive at a crucial point in this story. If they are generally fearless, then have them be scared at some point. But make it clear, either by the reaction of the people around them or maybe their own internal dialogue, that this is a contradiction, that this is something that frustrates them or frustrates the people around them. So one thing you can do is try to think of the defining qualities or characteristics of your main character or characters, and then think of the exact opposites and try to figure out a way to put in that into the story, that incorporate a scene where we can see that sort of three-dimensionality of your character. So, speaking of strengths and weaknesses, one thing that's talked a lot about in writing is the character arc. And I touched on this last week with plot, but your character needs to change and grow in the story, which means they need to start out with some sort of a weakness. So, by a weakness here, I mean a real weakness, a clear thing about them that needs addressing, something they may or may not know about themselves. It cannot be that they're just really clumsy or something. It has to be a real shortcoming, and it should somehow tie into the external struggles that they are dealing with. So if your character is scared all the time, then the external conflict should throw them into a situation where they need to exhibit extreme bravery, right? I just read Brave Ollie Possum to my kids, and that's the exact struggle that the main character Ollie has. He is extremely scared, and then he is thrown into a situation where he has to be brave. The risk with giving your characters weaknesses is that if they are too caustic of a personality, then you risk your readers not liking them. And if we don't like them, or just not caring about them. So that it's a fine balance. You know, if you have a character who is like starts out the story really melancholic or picked on or just kind of, I don't know, lackadaisical about life, then you're going to struggle with your reader being like, oh, I don't want to follow this person through 300 pages. Or if they start out really bitter, you know, so like Cora did. So that's why it's important to give your character a save the cat moment. This is not my term, but it's a super helpful one. I use it and think about it all the time. It's the moment early on in the story when your main character is walking downtown. It's a lovely day. She looks up. She sees a cat stuck in the tree, hanging by its claws. And your character, who maybe even happens to be afraid of heights, scales the tree and saves the cat. So now we love that character. We love, and by contrast, hate people based on their actions, or characters, I should say. So with Cora in The Winter King, she starts off the story very bitter and angry, right? Those are difficult character qualities to give a main character without losing your reader. We don't want to be inside the head of a bitter and angry person if that's all there is to them. So you can either give them, along with that, like a sharply biting sense of humor, which I did not do, or you can make them sympathetic because of the way they interact with the people around them. So Cora clearly and desperately wants to comfort her mother. She picks up her little sister and carries her home. Peter obviously sees something to love in her, and we like Peter, so we start looking for those qualities as well. I think sometimes we can think as writers that our main character has to be likable at all times, but that is really not true. We need to empathize with them, but some of the most interesting characters do things we don't agree with. But as long as we can understand why they are doing it, we're a lot more willing to go along with the story and go along with what they are doing. If you get to a point where you're like, I don't even understand why this character is doing this, this makes no sense, that's when you can lose your readers. So this kind of segues nicely into creating character relationships. Drama is about relationships. So you have your main character, and now you need to create an ally or several allies for your main character, as well as opponents. And it's important when you're coming up with your these other characters to make them very different than the main character so that they can act as a foil to your main character. This is why Peter is so unfailingly loyal to the Winter King. That's why I made him that way, because then Cora's kind of treasonous heart is even more obvious. So your characters should be coming into conflict with each other in small and large ways, because this type of drama adds interest to your story. And if characters are going along their merry way for too long without sparking one another, it just gets boring. So if you think of any famous sitcom, TV show, or book with a friend group, Ron, Hermione, and Harry, they are all very different personalities. If the screenwriters know what they're doing, they're going to craft them differently intentionally so that there will be that essential spark in them when they have to work together to solve a problem or to figure something out. So you should have files saved on all your main characters, the ones who get the most on-stage time. But then you still need to add in those secondary and tertiary characters. And just a little bit of advice for that. The further down you go down the line of characters in your book, the less well drawn they need to be. You do not need to spend a week researching a character who only shows up in one scene. However, you still want to make these characters interesting, which generally means giving them some defining feature or characteristic that you can very quickly point to and then move on. In the book I'm currently working on, I have someone show up super fast who I just describe as a boy in a 10-gallon hat with an inexcusable amount of freckles and a pistol which he spins deftly between his fingers. I think that's pretty much it. The nice thing, though, about descriptions is that they give us a chance to learn more, not just about the character you're describing, but also about the character who is seeing the person being described. So the book is from the point of view of a 12-year-old girl, and the fact that she uses the phrase inexcusable amount of freckles, it tells you she's a bit grumpy, that she's opinionated, right? So you can use any type of description as a way to point back to the person whose eyes you are looking through. And another side note here is to make sure that all of your characters are necessary. In The Winter King, I actually had two characters who I ended up combining into Nils, that lovely house steward. There was actually this extra alderman who was also just really nasty and threatening like Nils was. And at some point I realized that I did not need both of them there, putting the same pressure on Cora and Greta. So I just merged them into one character. Make sure everyone in your story is performing a specific and necessary function. And if they are not, then you kill them off. And then another note about characters is your bad guy. You want to write a really good bad guy. So who is the bad guy in your story? It might be obvious. It might be the person trying to destroy the world. But in many stories, it maybe isn't. And so you just have to think the antagonist in your story, the bad guy, is the person who is trying to stop your main character from reaching her goal. And that the antagonist needs to be necessary to the hero, which means his existence forces the main character to confront her own weakness. He needs to be believable. Again, he doesn't need to be likable, but he should be, or she should be, understandable. If your bad guy is just some big bad overlord who wants to rule the world, that's not an interesting antagonist. Everyone had a mother. Everyone has something they love. Everyone has something they are afraid of. So you still need to find those things in your antagonist. And really, most bad guys think they're in the right. They have a set of morals, a view of the world, and they think it's the right one. So really lean into that. Look at what their values are and how do they differ from your main character's values. Really good bad guys, though, are also scary because they are unpredictable. You don't know what they're going to do next. They have you on edge. So if you can have your bad guy do something early on that's unexpected and alarming, then that will set your reader on edge too, because they don't know what else this bad guy is capable of doing. You can also make your story more interesting, I think, by layering in your bad guys. So we think that this one person is the problem, but then your main character overcomes them or beats them, and then they move on to the next big bad guy. It's like gaining levels in Mario Brothers until you're finally face to face with the real overlord. That could be an interesting literary trick. Okay, so I thought I would answer. I got 2 questions on Instagram about characters, so I thought I'd answer those and then give really quickly some dialogue tips. The first question I got was, I feel like I have a strong setting and a pretty good direction for the plot, but my lead character is really flat. She accomplishes all her goals, but there's nothing particularly interesting about her yet. What should I consider when I round her out? So I think of a couple things. Maybe it's a personality issue. in which case you should look at the heroes that you admire in books or movies or even real life and sit down and write out what aspects of their personality draw you to them. The more clearly you can figure out why you are drawn to a character, the easier it is to write compelling characters. There are ways to give your main character sort of larger than life characteristics that really draw us to them. Maybe they have a quick wit, which is something Austen does with a lot of her main characters, right? Maybe they are super skilled at something that we would all find really cool to be able to do. Maybe you can show them exhibiting some moral integrity or generosity in a strained situation early on. One thing I do a lot right now when I'm reading novels is I pay close attention to what details the author is putting into the story to make us invested in their character early on. So if I find that I'm just really loving a character, I'll go back and look for clues as to why I feel that way. I just read True Grit, and part of what I think makes that story so compelling was the main character's just hilarious, self-confident voice. It's written in first person, and she just has this forthright, no frills mannerism that's really endearing. So find a way to showcase something interesting about their personality. This goes back to what I said earlier. Look around at your friends or people you know that you find interesting and think, what is memorable about them? What do I find so engaging about them? But make sure that you don't tell us, don't just tell us they're super good in a tight situation. You need to show us, right? That's the show, don't tell rule. One thing I've heard as feedback from people who've read The Winter King is that they really loved Cora for her tenaciousness. She is determined, she's got grit, and of course she goes too far. But people like to watch people who are determined, who have a really strong goal and are just going after it. So that's one situation, is make sure their personality isn't too just, vanilla. If your main character is just an average Joe, then you really do run the risk of other characters being more interesting. I ran a poll on Instagram, and I did not even look at the results, but I'm going to look now on Facebook Live here. But I asked the question, it's gone already. Well, I'm sure I can find it somewhere. I asked the question of, in the Lord of the Rings, was Frodo your favorite character in Lord of the Rings? I did that as like a yes or no questionnaire on Instagram. Oh, good. So I had 60 votes. 59 people voted no. One person voted yes. So in Lord of the Rings, Frodo, who is ostensibly the main character, nobody really likes him. Oh, is 97% Jen? Yes. Yeah. So, it's not that they don't like him, but they just find the other characters more interesting. And it's not as big of a deal in something like Lord of the Rings, where, the story itself is carried along so well. It's not like people are reading it and they're like, I don't like Frodo, so I'm going to stop reading the story. But compared to, you don't want your secondary characters overwhelming your main character so much that we're like, I wish the story had actually been written from Legolas's point of view or Aragorn's, or, you don't really want that. So back to the question though about if your character is not feeling deep, I would also spend more time fleshing out their backstory. So try to tease out aspects of their personality, their life, their hopes and dreams, and try to layer those in. We really, as humans, identify with longing. We like to see people actively wanting something and going for it. So if from page one you can have your character really wanting or longing for something, and that can change over time. That doesn't have to be like the end thing. It's just, for Cora, again, the thing she's really actively longing for is her mom to succeed in this feast. Also, we love mysteries. So if you have the main character withholding something from us a little bit and revealing bits of their personality or bits of their past as they go along, we find that interesting. And lastly, I would just again make sure that the plot is really important to them, that you are putting enough opposition against them that they are just super motivated to achieve the goal of the book. Because again, it's hard not to be invested in someone who is striving and fighting and struggling for what they believe in. The second question I got was, do you have any thoughts on entering the story through the eyes of a minor character, or introducing the protagonist through minor characters' observations of him? And this is kind of one of those questions that depends on how it's handled, because I could see it being done really well, but I could also see it being done poorly. So it almost sounds like something you might see in a prologue, maybe. Prologues are interesting, though, because some agents and editors really dislike them strongly and say, do not query me with a prologue. And then some don't mind them at all. So I would be careful introducing the story through the point of view, like through the eyes of a main character or of a minor character, because then we will be tempted to think the story is about them. So if you think about it like a movie, if the lens was focused on one character for the first 10 minutes of the movie, it would feel really abrupt and confusing if we switched to following someone else at the 10-minute mark for the rest of the movie. However, I think you could possibly do it, kind of like you said in your question, through the minor character's observations of him, as long as it was always pointing to him. So something like, the general consensus of the town was that Nicholas Nevermore was, blah, like, and then, Mrs. Norris had noticed that, etc., like that type of thing. So that shows us that we are still talking about Nicholas, but we're getting other people's experiences of him. I also think it never hurts to just try it, to see how it works, if it works. But then, of course, one last question would be, why are you doing this? Why do you think it's a better way of approaching the story than just starting in the head of the main character? Have you tried starting just in the head of the main character and maybe give that a try and see how that works? One last quick note on characters is their names. Names sound like things, right? We form ideas of people from the sounds of their names. A Bert is going to be a very different character than an Aragorn. You don't have to name your characters like, really strange names or really obvious names. Your bad guy doesn't have to be Lucifer. Sometimes you can use names in ironic ways, actually. The High Alderman in The Winter King, his name is Fyodor, which means God's gift. But then we have Matthias, whose name also means gift of God. So one of those is telling a lie about the character. Cora is actually from the Greek kore, which is sort of like just an any girl or every girl, but it was also another name for Persephone. So you can use your names like Easter eggs. I just think it's helpful to look up the meanings of names. And then also make sure your names are consistent in your fantasy world. So don't have a mother name one child Esmeralda and the next child Jane, unless it's intentional. And again, then you would want to point to it. If you're clearly showing the reader, like, look, I also get this weird thing I did, then they'll trust you. So I think that's all I want to say for characters. Sorry, I'm probably going to run a little long today, but I think I will move on to dialogue now. And if you guys have any questions, you can ask me at the end. One last thing I want to say about characters is that my characters don't usually come to life for me until several drafts in. Even if I've done all this work up front, they don't really feel real until I have walked through the story with them. So that's okay. If you feel like your characters are a little bland and you're just, you're only on chapter 2, don't worry about that. So whether you're writing your character notebooks ahead of time or after draft 1, maybe draft 1 is your rough draft, like I said, your outline, like I said last time. as long as you're getting to know them and exploring them as people, making sure they aren't just like little mini versions of you. Like, this is grumpy Christine, this is generous Christine. It doesn't really matter how you get it done. You can always go back, I think, and layer in more character. Okay, so dialogue. I love dialogue, mainly because I'm not particularly good at it. It is really hard, and so it's like the skill that I feel like I'm still working to master in my own writing. Dialogue is a neat little trick because we're not actually writing people the way they talk. We're writing in an affected way that sounds believable. So we do not add in all of the yas and buts and ums and wells and that would just drive people crazy if we actually wrote our characters writing or talking the way that people talk in real life. But you also, you're making them not sound like robots. So the first way to develop a good ear for dialogue, I think, is to eavesdrop. I'm sorry, parents who are listening in on this with your children, but it's true. If you listen to the rhythms of speech, you'll notice how some people speak in short, punchy sentences. Some people run on, some people circle back, and others are more logical. We all trail off. We all leave a lot of things implied. None of us hardly ever says what we're really thinking. If you ever hear a particularly intriguing bit of dialogue, I suggest you write it down or try to pay attention to how you talk throughout the day. What do you say? What do you leave out? As you get older, you'll notice that people say things differently in different places, and you should write those types of tics down. My sister moved from Washington, where we grew up, Spokane, to Iowa, and she was totally thrown off by the way people there use the word yet. Some of you, if listening, may do this, but they use it to mean still, right? So they'll say, "We're eating dinner yet." Or they asked her, "Do you want your dinner yet?" And she thought, "Well, I already have my dinner." "Oh, do you?" And are you? What they really meant was, "Do you want your dinner still, or are you ready for us to take it away?" Some places drop the to be verb, so instead of "this needs to be washed," they say "this needs washed." Those types of things will make your characters sound different from each other. Beware of using dialogue as filler. Dialogue should always achieve a purpose. But there are lots of different purposes. It can be to resolve a plot point. It can be to reveal something important about a character. It can be to move the plot forward. It can be to change the dynamics or the polarity between two characters. So just some tips for writing good dialogue. The first one is to read a lot, because you will get the pacing down that way. You'll develop an ear for it. And by the pacing, I mean how often you switch up dialogue and character tags and action beats and description, that sort of thing. You don't want to have too long of just two characters talking with nothing else going on between them. Sorry, I had a tab pop up on my screen. There we go. Another tip is that the word said is invisible. And so use that word much more than you use verbs like muttered or sang or snapped or, just use said. It might be boring, but it might seem boring to you, but it actually is not. It's super important that you read your dialogue out loud. It's actually important to read your whole book out loud at some point, but specifically the dialogue. If you have a willing spouse or sibling, try even just having them do a dialogue exchange with you, taking out all of the descriptions and stuff, and see if it sounds like it could actually happen. After you've written your dialogue, go back and cut and shorten it. Use contractions. Leave out verbs or nouns if they're not needed, because that's how people talk. Unless, of course, it's not how your character talks. Is your character a rambler, or are they, like Matthias, a priest? We actually left in a lot of the contractions, or I lengthened my verbs or my words from, instead of don't, I did do not, because it sounds more archaic, more formal, and that's what I was trying to get across with his character. I would avoid unnecessary dialogue. That would be like, "Hi, Tom," said Nancy. "Hi, Nancy," said Tom. "How are you, Tom?" said Nancy. "Very well, Nancy," said Tom. "Thanks for asking." So that might actually happen, right? But it's so boring. When you bring a character into a scene, you want to get straight to the point. However, some people, myself included, have to actually write those parts to get to where we need to go so that we can go back and cut those parts. Okay? So it is hard to just jump right into the heart of the matter. If you need to wade in slowly, then go ahead and do it. And then just make sure that you go back and look and see, okay, I don't need these parts. I can leave that out or leave it unsaid. Don't use dialogue to recap. This is something we are all tempted to do. Well, as you know, Larry, that type of thing. Or, "We've already discussed this, Larry. I found Tom in the dining room with the candlestick." It's just gimmicky, and people notice it when you're trying to convey something through sort of forced dialogue like that. Try not using dialogue and see what happens. Instead of giving a character a response, give them an action. And don't have your characters sound like parrots of each other. This is really easy to do, and I do it all the time, and then I have to go back and fix it, which is like having character A say, "Don't you want me to be happy?" And then character B says, "Of course I want you to be happy, but I also think," like, it's like repeating what the other person said. Instead, try something like character A says, "Don't you want me to be happy?" And character B responds with, "You said you wanted my help." So in that situation, the first character is asking an accusing question, right? "Don't you want me to be happy?" And the second character returns it with an accusation. "You said you wanted my help." So that's just a far more interesting conversation. And it throws the weight back onto character A. Maybe another thing you could do is have character B not even respond. Maybe he shakes his head, he throws up his hands, he walks away. Those are all responses too, right? So those are some tips on dialogue. I put it along with character because they are so closely connected. If you know your character well, then their dialogue will come more naturally. And if you know your characters well and they are all different, then their dialogue will sound different. If you have a good feel for them as a person, their age, their education level, their ethnicity, their familiarity with the main language in your story, all of these things are going to influence how they talk. One last little note is that I would leave out dialect. Like, I would not, I'm thinking of Mark Twain. The way when you're trying to read like shortened words or the dialect like written out, that can be really confusing and hard. I think it's much better to just say he spoke with a deep South accent or something instead of trying to show that in the dialogue. That can also, again, come across gimmicky. So next week, we're going to talk about kind of the last wrapping up things. We'll talk about first chapters and their importance because they are so important, especially if you are wanting to shop your story around. You will either hook an agent or not in your first chapter, first 10 pages, however long it is. And also they just set up a whole lot for the book, so they carry a lot of weight. We'll talk about editing, giving and receiving feedback, finding critique partners, taking critique partners' advice, those sorts of things. We'll see how much I can get through in an hour. That's kind of what I'm shooting for. And I am planning on, at least for now, if anyone is interested, offering feedback on first chapters. I have found that to be super helpful for me, especially if you don't have a critique group set up. Or I can give feedback on your query letter. And I think what I'll probably do is just give my email address at the end of the webinar next time, or you can send me a private message and let me know. And I'll just charge a flat $20 fee because it usually takes me an hour or two to read through someone's first chapter and give them notes. Usually what I look for is big picture things. Where do I think this is leading? What are you setting up? How are your characters acting, and what could you do to make them pop more on the page? Or and then also going into line edits as well. Things that you can look for to help to fix throughout the rest of your manuscript. Maybe problem issues in the actual text, the forming of sentences. So that would be first chapter. A query letter is a whole different beast, but I have written and rewritten many query letters, and I actually really like doing them. So if that's something, if you're like ready to shop your book around, you don't feel like you need the first chapter critiqued, but you would like a set of eyes on your query letter, you could send that to me also. If there, I don't see any questions on here. I don't know, I guess I can ask. Does anyone have any questions before I sign off on characters or dialogue? Do you like writing characters and dialogue? Do you find it difficult? Those are my, I actually love writing characters. And I could spend like way too long researching them. I have in several books had critique partners come back and be like, why is this scene in here? And I'm like, it's because I enjoy listening to these two characters talk to each other. Is that not a good enough reason? And as it turns out, it's not. So I end up cutting like full scenes from my books because it's just me delighting in my characters so much. Let's see, do you have any resource recommendations for formatting dialogue? Well, I mean, there's always like Strunk and White, I'm not sure if they deal specifically with like, if you're talking about like the commas and the quotation marks, that would be the book that I recommended on Instagram today by Tom Chiarella. It's called Writing Dialogue. That one has, I think, a chapter near the end where it talks specifically about formatting things. Okay, do you know when your next book is coming out? No, I do not, because I have not submitted a new book to an editor yet. As it turns out, quarantine is killing my creativity time, which is fine, but it'll probably be a while still. Do you have a character template that you use to flesh them out? I've used some in the past. I'm trying to think. This is not like super helpful, but if you went back through my talk, the questions that I sort of threw out there are the ones that I use. So I just went back and looked at, like for my Venice story, what were the questions that I ask my main characters that I think of for them. So there's the basics, like I said, age, hair color, eye color, those types of things. And then the backstory, because those are really important questions. Who are you? Where are you from? And then the personality, what do they want? What do they fear? What are their ambitions? What are their goals? And then any important tics or defining characteristics, I also put in there. But I don't have one from like a book that I use, although I know there are some really great ones. Okay, and then the last one, what if your character is weird or crazy? That is something that if you have a character who is odd, it is really helpful to point to it so that your readers know that you are in on the joke. And when I say point to it, what I mean is have other characters noticing it, right? So think of it like in a movie. If a character does something really weird, then you'll have the camera move over to another character with like their eyebrows raised or like, what are you doing? That type of thing. So that's something you can do if your character is eccentric, I think, so that people reading it don't think that you just think this is normal. I am not sure what if you don't explain your well. I'm not sure what that means, but yeah, sorry. Anyway, so yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for listening in again, guys. And I will be back next week with editing. And yeah, thanks for tuning in. Talk to you next week.